Hi, Deacon Ed McCormick here. As we begin Holy Week, I'd like to present to you a few videos on the meaning of Jesus' crucifixion from a biblical point of view. To begin with, I'd like you to first think about what comes to your mind when you hear or think about Jesus' crucifixion. And what do you think is its meaning for us in our world? Now, before I get into the biblical meaning of Jesus' cross, I'd like to clear the decks by identifying a number of popular understandings of the cross that can actually lead to some distorted views. Here's the first one. This is very popular. There is the assumption that Jesus died so that we could go to heaven. And while it is true that Jesus' death and resurrection means that he is present in heaven and that when we die we hope that we will see him there, the primary meaning of Jesus' death has nothing to do with us going to heaven. If you read the Gospels, you read Paul's letters, you will find they say almost nothing about Jesus' death and our going to heaven. This view really comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. Even though many people who preach about it and believe this don't know it comes from that great philosopher, it does. And Plato's idea was that we need to get out of this world and out of our bodies because the goal of human life was to live a disembodied life in the world of ideas. So that's the first popular assumption that really has very little basis in Scripture. Here's the second one, and you hear this preached about often. Because of the death of Jesus, the gates of heaven have been opened. It's a similar version to the one we just mentioned. The problem with this idea is that it lays the blame for the problem the cross deals with on God locking up the gates of heaven. Now, of course, there really are no gates in heaven. But more than that, the biblical idea is not that God is somehow this angry parent who's mad at his kids and has decided to change the lock so that they can't get into the house. That's not the God of the New Testament. That is a pagan view of God. If you read the ancient pagan myths in Homer and in the Odyssey and the Iliad and others, you will find that the gods love to do cruel things to human beings, love to punish them. So this idea of God locking the gates of heaven, that's a Greek idea. You see, the biblical idea is that the problem is not with God locking the gates of heaven. The problem is with our hard hearts and the harmful and hurtful behavior that emerges because we have hard hearts. So what has to be unlocked are our hearts, not the gates of heaven. Here's a third approach to understanding the cross that has some problems. The classic theological version of this is Anselm's satisfaction theory. Saint Anselm tried to explain why Christ had to die by drawing on the feudal understanding of the honor of the landowner. And the idea is that with the sin of Adam and Eve, God the Creator's honor had been offended. And no human being could pay back this honor because it was infinite. But because Jesus was human and divine, he, as a human being, could pay back through his death the infinite honor owed to God because he was also divine. Now, the problem with this view of God is that it quickly devolved into this image of this angry, hateful God. I had one of my parishioners recently say to me that he had been taught that God created the world and our job was to obey God's rules, and we broke them. And therefore, we were to be punished. But Jesus died for us, and so he took on our punishment. And this promotes an angry view of God. It's almost like God hates the world, but because Jesus died, God killed him instead of us. And this leads to a very problematic spirituality in which people can believe that suffering is somehow divinely sanctioned. You can even get people believing that they should endure suffering, even unjust, brutal suffering, and that this will somehow get them closer to God. This is a real problem in a country that has enslaved African Americans and lynched African Americans, where women are often in very abusive and violent relationships. And any spirituality that claims that God desires that we suffer can be very problematic. Furthermore, you could get people arguing that God used violence to save the world, and therefore we can use violence to save the world. All of these are very problematic. Now, let's look at what leads to some of these distorted views by paying attention to what is actually missing from these accounts of the crucifixion. Here's the first thing I want you to notice. All of these accounts of the crucifixion are disconnected from Jesus' kingdom ministry, from his entire ministry, and from his conviction that God's kingdom was coming in and through what he said and did. There's no connection at all between these approaches to the cross and Jesus' kingdom ministry. Nor is there any connection between the merciful and loving God proclaimed by Jesus and these views of the crucifixion. Furthermore, there's no connection between these understandings of the cross and Jesus' resurrection, the new creation that dawns because of Jesus' resurrection, the birth of a new covenant people. All of that seems to be absent from these views of the cross. So, how do we start to understand the crucifixion from a biblical point of view? Well, let's start by returning to the first century and begin with how the Romans understood crucifixion. Thousands upon thousands of people were crucified by the Romans at the time of Jesus. And for the Romans, the message of the cross is that we are in charge, we are superior, you are inferior. It promoted a terrifying and horrifying message of domination and control by Rome. And do not mess with us, or you will endure incredible agony and a shameful, horrifying death. For the Jews, for first century Jews who were often crucified by the Romans, the cross was looked on as this instrument of horror and great shame. Along come the Christians, the early church, St. Paul, and then the gospel writers. And all of a sudden you get a very different view of the message of the cross. The first thing is the cross is viewed as God's victory. And there seems to be this explosion of metaphors for the meaning of the cross. And we will explore what some of those are later. But it's very clear that the cross means the defeat of evil, the defeat of idols and idolatry, freedom from sin and death, and the dawning of God's new world. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What led to such a dramatic change in the message of the cross? Across the Roman Empire, it clearly meant Rome was in charge, Rome dominates. It sent out a message of horror and shame. By the time Paul starts writing his letters and the early Christians start preaching and the Gospels are written, the Christians introduce a completely new message about the cross. What led to that change? The answer to that question will be in my next video.